When the late Golda Meir was the Prime Minister of Israel, she invited Charles de Gaulle to visit the country. He was reluctant, she was persistent, and so de Gaulle made his one and only visit to Israel. Everything went very well, and Golda asked de Gaulle whether there was anything that he had not seen that he wanted to see before returning to Paris. De Gaulle mentioned that he would like to visit the tomb of Israel's unknown soldier to pay his respects, because after all, when foreign dignitaries come to France, they always lay a wreath at the tomb of France's unknown soldier. Golda, of course, agreed and told de Gaulle that on the way to the airport, there's a cemetery, and in that cemetery is the tomb of Israel's unknown soldier, and that they would stop there on the way to the airport. De Gaulle was very pleased. Now, after de Gaulle and his entourage left Golda's office, one of Golda's aides began to panic because at that time there was no tomb of Israel's unknown soldier. Now, of course, there is. Don't worry, Golda told her aide. On the way to the airport, there's a cemetery. You get there before we do. Pick out a nice grave, put some wreaths over the tombstone, and put up a sign that says, "Here lies Israel's unknown soldier." And so the aide did as Golda had ordered. On the way to the airport, the motorcade stopped at the cemetery. De Gaulle got out of his limo, accompanied by a cadre of solemn generals and adjutants. Golda got out of her limo, surrounded by ministers and generals. The national anthems of Israel and France were played. A volley of guns was fired, and de Gaulle ceremoniously placed a wreath on the grave and saluted. But just as he was about to enter the limo to go to the airport, a huge wind came up and blew the wreaths away from the tombstone, and now they could see the inscription on the tombstone, which read, "Here lies Hyman Shapiro of Cleveland, Ohio, a devoted husband, a wonderful father, a great industrialist, and a faithful friend of Israel." De Gaulle read this and he was shocked. Golda's aides were embarrassed. So de Gaulle turned to Golda Meir and said, "I thought you told me that this is the tomb of Israel's unknown soldier." And Golda, who was never short of words, said to de Gaulle, "You see, General de Gaulle, as a husband, as a father, as an industrialist, and as a great friend of Israel, Hyman Shapiro of Cleveland, Ohio, was known. But as a soldier, he was unknown." Now, what I would like to suggest to you is that similarly, the subject of today's discussion, Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah, is also unknown. And my task today is to try to make it a little less unknown. Now, to paraphrase the great American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, a mystic without a paradox is like a lover without passion. Mystics, especially Jewish mystics, love paradoxes. One of my favorites is the statement by the Hasidic master Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who said, "Nothing is as whole as a broken heart." But the paradox I want to focus on for a few minutes now is the current interest in Jewish mysticism and the profound impact Jewish mysticism has on our culture, despite the fact that it is largely unknown. Yet this is not a new phenomenon, because already in 16th century Krakow, the greatest rabbi of that time and place, Rabbi Moses Isserles, wrote that in his day, everybody wants to study Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, even though they can't tell one biblical verse from another. So in 400 years, very little has changed. Now, when my younger brother, many years ago, was in grammar school, he had to write his very first essay. And the topic was biology. And here's the first sentence of his essay. "Biology is everywhere. You can't get rid of it." And I would suggest that you can say the same thing regarding Jewish mysticism today. It's everywhere. You can't get rid of it. Some examples. Example number 1. Reports from Hollywood tell us that Roseanne, Madonna, and Barbra Streisand are attending classes in Kabbalah. In New York, Isaac Mizrahi and many of his fashion models attend classes in Kabbalah. Classes in Jewish mysticism seem available everywhere, from Borders bookstore to Harvard. Second example, 2 operas have recently been written exploring and expressing themes from Jewish mysticism. One is the Dibuk, about possession and exorcism, by the composer in residence here of the Chicago Lyric Opera, Shulamit Ran. And the second example is an opera by Deborah Drattel, the composer in residence of the New York City Opera, on Lilith, the queen of the demons, according to the Jewish mystical tradition. A third example, the legend of the Golem that emerges from Jewish mystical tradition is probably the most influential Jewish legend since the Bible was canonized. This legend deals with the creation of life through magical, or as we'd say today, technological means. In 1997, a book on the Golem by David Wisniewski won the award for the best children's book in America. And the play on the Golem opened a few months later in the historic Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., where Lincoln was assassinated. The Golem factors into current discussions of bioethics, especially as it relates to genetic engineering, cloning, and biotechnology. And in February '97, even the show The X-Files had an episode about the Golem. Fourth example, the opening exhibit of the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Chicago, called Negotiating Rapture, stressed the impact of Jewish mystical motifs on contemporary art and on contemporary artists. Throughout the world, artists in search of symbols to express are trying to tap into the rich symbolism found in the Jewish mystical tradition. A fifth example, Jewish mystical themes have become a mainstay, not only for Jewish writers such as Elie Wiesel and Isaac Bashevis Singer, but also for non-Jewish writers such as Umberto Eco, particularly in his novel Foucault's Pendulum. And recently, even books on management are beginning to use Jewish mystical ideas and motifs, such as the Kabbalah of money. So, Jewish mysticism is everywhere. We can't get rid of it. The influence of Jewish mysticism on Western culture, including contemporary Western culture, is not a new phenomenon. As scholars have demonstrated, the influence of Jewish mysticism on Renaissance thought was profound. And through Renaissance thinkers, Kabbalah made its way into the mainstream of Western civilization. And scholars are finding direct influences now of Jewish mysticism in unlikely places, such as the writings of Western philosophers such as Leibniz and John Locke, and of course in the works and ideas of Freemasonry, which has an impact even on how the American dollar bill looks, which has many numerologies in it, by the way. Let me now offer one more example of the many that could be given of interest in Kabbalah in this country, an example that goes back to the colonial period. In 1773, a certain Rabbi Tuvia ben Yehuda from Poland was visiting the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, and he received word that a certain Ezra Stiles wanted to meet him. And we know that he met with Ezra Stiles at least 3 times. What was the subject of the conversation? Jewish mysticism. And in particular, Stiles was interested in the magical and alchemical teachings of 2 classical Jewish mystical texts, namely the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, and the Zohar. Now, who was this Ezra Stiles? He was one of the first presidents of Yale University. In view of all of this, it seems to me a bit ironic, if not paradoxical, that until very recently, despite the interest in Jewish mysticism by non-Jews, Jewish thinkers in the modern period, both secular and religious, both in Western Europe and in the United States, have downplayed or even have demeaned the Jewish mystical tradition. And I want to give a few examples of this. First, Spinoza. Spinoza is often depicted as the first modern secular Jewish philosopher, and by some as the first modern secular Jew. And about Jewish mystics, Spinoza, in his great work, the Theological Political Treatise, wrote, and I quote, "I have read and known certain Kabbalistic triflers whose insanity provokes my unceasing astonishment." Second example, the parent of the so-called Jewish Enlightenment, or in Hebrew Haskalah, was Moses Mendelssohn, the grandfather of the composer Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's view that Judaism is a rational religion devoid of mysticism was to have an enormous impact on modern Judaism, particularly Reform Judaism. And indeed, the reforms of the Jewish liturgy begun by the early Jewish reformers in 19th century Germany were directly influenced by Mendelssohn and by his disciple David Friedlander. Now here's a sample of Friedlander's writings on the subject. Again, a quote. "From century to century, these prayers became more and more numerous and worse. The conceptions more mystical, more muddied with the principles of Jewish mysticism, that is Kabbalah, which, he says, is in direct contradiction to the genuine spirit of Judaism." One more example. The greatest Jewish historian of the 19th century, and perhaps of all times, was Heinrich Gretz. His 9-volume History of the Jews, Geschichte der Juden, was and remains enormously influential. Now here are some samples of his views, the greatest Jewish historian of all times, on Jewish mysticism. A few quotes. 1. The empty Kabbalah could not fail to arouse enthusiasm in empty heads. About the Zohar, the central work of Jewish mysticism, Gretz wrote, "Occasionally it gives a faint suggestion of an idea, but in a trice that evaporates into feverish fantasies or dissolves into childish silliness." And on the last great movement in Jewish mysticism called Hasidism, Gretz writes, "This daughter of darkness," referring to Hasidism, "even today proceeds stealthily on its mystical way, plunging Jewry into a state of primitive barbarism." That's his evaluation of Kabbalah. Now, yet despite the attempts of many modern Jewish thinkers to censor and to demean and to suppress and to ridicule and to even excommunicate Jewish mysticism from Judaism, nevertheless, Jewish mysticism is everywhere. You can't get rid of it. So what is Jewish mysticism that modern Jews, unappreciative of the richness of their heritage, have largely failed to acknowledge or to appreciate? What is Jewish mysticism that has made such a profound impact on Western civilization? What is this virtually unknown, while today exceedingly popular, part of Jewish thought, life, and practice? Now, Jewish mysticism is called in Hebrew Kabbalah. Kabbalah means literally that which has been received. And that which has been received over hundreds of years from generation to generation is tradition. So Kabbalah is tradition. It's Jewish tradition. Now, interestingly enough, while the Jewish mystical tradition is called Kabbalah, the Jewish philosophical tradition is never called Kabbalah by Jewish traditional texts, because the Jewish philosophical tradition is not considered something that is passed down, but is rather considered the random individual speculation of various philosophers who happen to be Jews. And in my view, even Jewish law, if you look at the text, is not usually referred to as Kabbalah. Jewish law is usually referred to as Masoret, that which is transmitted rather than that which is received. Kabbalah is that which is received. It is tradition. Kabbalah, therefore, is not, as Gretz put it, a lunatic trend within Judaism. Rather, Kabbalah, despite modern Jewish attempts to excommunicate it from Judaism, It's rather, I suggest, at the very heart of Jewish tradition. And I could give you many examples to demonstrate why this is so, but I want to limit myself to one example. The heart of a religion can be seen in its liturgy. And in the traditional Jewish liturgy, we see the overwhelming presence and influence of Kabbalah and of the Kabbalists. Look at the Jewish holidays, for example. Let's take Passover first. There's a Passover Seder. On the table at the Passover Seder is the Passover plate with various items on it, symbolizing various things relating to Passover, the egg, the shank bone, the this and that. Now, there is a standard configuration for the items on the plate. Why do we put the bone over here and the egg over there? The origin of this standard configuration is the Kabbalistic teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived in 16th century Israel. Each of the items on the plates corresponds to one of what the Kabbalists call the Sefirot, or the divine powers or emanations of God. Now, in a few days, we will celebrate the Jewish festival of Shavuot, the Pentecost. And it's on that holiday when the custom known as the Tikkun Leil Shavuot is celebrated, where traditionally sacred texts are studied the whole night. This practice also comes from the Lurianic mystics, who devised it as an act of tikkun, or an act of repairing the torn fabric of creation, and as a means to attaining for themselves a semblance of the revelation at Sinai, which is what we celebrate on Shavuot. And the final example, coming from the liturgy of many hundreds that could be offered, is the Friday evening service, the Kabbalah Shabbat service, welcoming the Sabbath, with its great hymn to the Sabbath, the Lecha Dodi. All of this is Kabbalistic. The selection of the Psalms we say for that service and the great hymn Lecha Dodi is the product of the great 16th century Jewish mystic Rabbi Moses Cordovero, and Lecha Dodi the product of his brother-in-law Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, whose name, by the way, you can see is written in that Lecha Dodi hymn in an acrostic. So Jewish mysticism is Kabbalah. It is tradition. It is at the heart of Judaism. Judaism as a religion would be inconceivable without it, historically, theologically, and liturgically. Now, some of you are familiar with the quip that if you have 3 Jews, you get 4 opinions and 5 organizations. So you should hardly expect that Jewish mysticism would be monolithic and that everybody would agree on everything. In other words, over many hundreds of years, in countless countries throughout the world, Jewish mysticism has flourished and has developed in various ways and in various forms. So let me now try to summarize this whole enterprise we call Jewish mysticism by suggesting that there are 5 major types of Jewish mysticism, or 5 major types of Jewish mystical experience, and that each of these 5 focuses on a certain goal, and that each of them utilizes certain techniques to try to reach this goal. And this goal is to attain a certain type of mystical experience. And the techniques are means of trying to attain these types of experience. However, very often these 5 types are not mutually exclusive, because in different times and different places they are sometimes found together in a variety of combinations of one or another, sometimes in the same movement, and sometimes you find these different trends even in the same thinker. And in Hasidism, the last movement in Jewish mysticism that began in 18th century Poland, all of these 5 are found. Now, the first type is one that has been characterized by my teacher, the late Professor Max Kedushin, as normal mysticism. Indeed, Kedushin depicts Judaism itself as what he calls normal mysticism. What does this mean, normal mysticism? Kedushin was well aware that various forms of Jewish mysticism entailed extraordinary and paranormal experiences brought about by very sophisticated meditative disciplines and techniques. But he was also aware that daily traditional Jewish practice also aimed at and could achieve some level, some dimension of the mystical experience. Kedushin begins by accepting the definition of mysticism offered by perhaps the greatest writer in the English language on mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, a British Anglican who lived in the first half of this century. Underhill's works, though rarely advertised, remain constantly in print. And she defined mysticism, or mystical experience, as a conscious awareness of the presence of the divine. A conscious awareness of the presence of the divine. Now, you know from Fiddler on the Roof, if from nowhere else, that Judaism has a blessing for everything. Getting up in the morning, washing your hands, going to the bathroom, eating breakfast, for everything. Each of these blessings starts the same way. Blessed are you, God. Now, Kedushin's observation is that saying that blessing that begins, blessed are you, God, is a stimulus to becoming consciously aware of the presence of God. That is, to having a mystical experience, albeit a normal, not a paranormal mystical experience. This conscious awareness of the presence of God, in his view, is stimulated by addressing God in the second person, blessed are you. Here, the awareness of God accompanies normal things that we do in the course of the normal daily routine. Hence, normal mysticism, where recitation of the blessing evokes a conscious awareness of the presence of God. In this way, a form of Jewish mysticism is available to each person, each moment in the normal course of the day. In other words, each moment can be a spiritually dormant moment, or it can be a mystical moment, a moment of significance, a moment in communion with God, and the choice is all ours. Normal mysticism is a kind of open enrollment mysticism, using very simple techniques available to anybody at any time. Here in normal mysticism, we also see a vital aspect of Jewish mysticism that is found in each of its types, namely the expectation of an adherence to Jewish law and to ritual practice. In this view, Jewish law, or halakha, is the necessary prerequisite for the Jewish mystical experience. In other words, Judaism without mysticism is a body without a soul. But Judaism and Jewish mysticism without Jewish law and without ritual observance is like a soul without a body. It's just a vagabond spirit. At this point, I should also mention that for Judaism, the most important religious practice, the highest of all the commandments, is Talmud Torah, the study of the sacred texts of the tradition. And for the Jewish mystics, the study of Jewish mystical texts, rather than being a means toward a mystical experience, is itself, if it's done correctly, a mystical experience. For as one medieval text puts it, in prayer, we speak to God. But in studying the Torah, God speaks to us. In other words, a goal of the mystic is to achieve a form of prophetic revelation where God speaks to us. And one way in which this can be done is through study of the Torah, where God speaks to us through the sacred text. Now, there is an old Kabbalistic tradition that God's presence can be found in the letters of the Torah. So by entering into the letters, through studying the sacred text, the mystic thereby encounters the presence of God. In other words, the text is the rendezvous for communion with God. In other words, study in Jewish mysticism, I don't think you have this in other mysticisms, study in Jewish mysticism is a technique that can lead to a mystical experience. And this brings us now to the second form of Jewish mystical experience. First was normal mysticism. The second is called in Hebrew dveikut, or communion with God. This is a more intense form of experience than is available through normal mysticism. Dveikut, or cleaving to God, appears in three major forms: cleaving, union, and reunion. Cleaving means extreme intimacy with God without union or without absorption of the individual into the divine. In many sources, this cleaving, or in Hebrew dveikut, is depicted in blatantly, almost pornographically, erotic terms. Union means the union, that is, the absorption of the mystic within the divine, whereby the individual loses his or her individual identity. And one common analogy the mystics use is a comparison of the soul of the individual to a drop of water and God to the sea. In itself, the drop has individuality, but once the drop is immersed and merged into the sea, it becomes completely absorbed, losing all individuality. And the third variety of dveikut, reunion, means that since all souls have their origin in God, the goal is for the soul to reunite with its original source, namely with God. So reunion is a homecoming for the soul. But for the Kabbalists, union or reunion is not necessarily the end of the story. The mystic subsequently experiences the difficulty of re-entry back into the world. And here again there is a paradox. The mystical experience, by its very nature, is transformatory. It aims at transforming the person spiritually. And the paradox is that the mystic finds himself by losing himself within God. Now, in achieving dveikut, a variety of techniques may be used. And virtually all texts assume that the Kabbalist moves toward the divine through the observance of the commandments and the study of the Torah. But also important here is the cultivation of the moral virtues, especially humility. For the Kabbalist, the arrogant person who is full of himself is therefore incapable of union or intimacy with God. The cultivation of piety, or chassidut in Hebrew, is the necessary prerequisite for intimacy with God. Now, of course, there was a variety of views as to what constituted piety. There are also various meditative techniques, and like all meditative techniques, the ones used by the Kabbalists have two goals. Goal number one is shutting out outside static, and goal number two is focusing attention on that which transcends us, in this case, shutting out the static of the world and focusing attention on the reality and on the presence of God. Now, dveikut, or cleaving to God, begins with the awareness that there is a gap between us and God. And achieving dveikut means the successful utilization of techniques which aim at bridging that gap between us and God. But here, too, there is a paradox, there is an irony, which is that once the mystic has successfully bridged that gap and has achieved communion with God, the mystic then realizes that the very perception of the gap at the outset was only an illusion. So bridging the gap really means attaining the awareness that the gap was never really there. Bridging the gap does not therefore really entail going from one point to another point, but it entails rather realizing where and with whom we really are. It means realizing that often the destination and the point of departure are the same. Now, the third form of Jewish mystical experience, the first being normal mysticism, the second dveikut, or cleaving to God, the third form is what scholars today call Theosophical Theurgic Kabbalah. This is perhaps the most pervasive form of Jewish mysticism and the central form in the major literary work of the Jewish mystics called the Zohar. Here the goal is to penetrate the inner life of God, that's the Theosophical, and then to influence that inner life of God by our deeds, that's the Theurgical. In this view, not only are human beings in need of God, But God is also in need of us in order to be God and in order to be truly one. Here you have the idea that everything we do, every act we perform, influences not only ourselves and our society, but also influences God, has an impact on God. In this view, human power and human significance are immense. In this view, the human being is not helplessly dependent upon God, but rather the opposite. The human being has a crucial role, not only in the redemption of the world, but also in the redemption of God. As the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, put it, it's as if each person has an antenna attached to their head extending upward into the heavens. And so that every movement a person makes, everything a person does, has an effect, an impact on that which is above. Here as well, in this variety of Jewish mysticism, we also find erotic motifs. A goal of human activity in this view is to bring about a union between the male aspects of God and the female aspects of God. And this union is brought about through human deeds, through virtuous deeds, particularly through observing the commandments, what they called in Aramaic the zivuga kadisha, the holy marriage between the male and female elements of God, can be accomplished. Thus, the sexual act becomes for them the paradigm for all of existence. On the other hand, evil deeds, sin, brings about the alienation of the male and female forces within God, which causes a disruption of the flow of divine grace downward to the world, and causes the vulnerability of the feminine aspects of God, particularly the one called in Hebrew Shekhinah, to the forces of what the Zohar calls the Sitra Achra, the other side, the demonic. In this erotic and even orgasmic view of things, human action is taken with utmost seriousness and viewed as having utmost power, and human beings having utmost responsibility. In this view, the individual human being has not only enormous power, but enormous responsibility, precisely because the very disposition of God is in his or her hands. Now, the fourth approach may be called the affective view, and in a sense, it's the opposite of the view I just discussed, the Theosophical Theoretic view. Here, the goal is to draw down from above the flow of divine grace into the world. In Hasidism, for example, it was believed that certain individuals, such as the Hasidic master, the tzaddik, have the ability to serve as a channel for directing the flow of divine grace from the upper world down to our world. The ability to draw down divine grace is, in their view, what brings good things into the world, like prosperity and health. Yet here again, there is also a paradox. The most spiritual person, namely the tzaddik, is able to ensure the most physical and material benefits to his community. Drawing down the divine potency from above to our world is often linked to certain forms of Jewish magic, including incantations and spells and charms. For example, the incantation can dislodge the divine forces of grace that may somehow be stuck in their downward flow to the world. Charms and amulets can overcome the powers of the demonic and allow the powers of the divine to prevail. The amulet or the talisman can serve as a receptacle for the downward flow of divine grace, and then can act as a transmitter of that grace and power to the person who wears the amulet or the talisman. A form of Kabbalah, affective Kabbalah, is the Golem. This means that by harnessing the divine power of creativity and life force, the Kabbalist becomes able to do what God can do, and that is to create even life itself. Now, the theurgic and affective views are similar in that both aim at affecting the divine, but here the focus is different. The theurgical view, the earlier view, is theocentric. It is centered on God. It is centered on the well-being of the divine. This view, the affective view, is anthropocentric. It's focused on human beings because the goal is to improve the material conditions of society. Nonetheless, very often both views are found together. In the theurgic view, we have the choice of sending up either good stuff or bad stuff, and in the affective view, we draw down what is above. But in the final analysis, what goes up must come down, namely what we put into the tubes running upward and downward from our world to the upper world and back again is what we eventually get back. And now fifth and finally, there is the ecstatic or prophetic Kabbalah. Here the goal is blatantly anthropocentric. The goal is transformatory, where the mystic seeks to encounter himself in his completely self-realized form with all of his potentials actualized. Here the mystic, in the mystical experience, meets himself as he can be with all his potentials realized. Here the mystic meets his own true self. Once that encounter takes place, the task of the mystic is to transform himself from who he now is to who he now knows he can yet become. In this experience, the mystic also achieves a form of revelation. Aspects of the true, essential, inner core meaning of the Torah are revealed to him. The mystic is then challenged not only to correlate who he is with what he can yet become, but also to correlate what his community is with what it should become. And this relates to the socially activistic nature of Jewish mysticism. The mystic, despite popular misconceptions, is not the one who retreats from society, but is rather the one who takes on his society, who risks everything to transform society, to transform his religious community from what it is to what it should be, based upon what was imparted in the experience of mystical illumination. This fifth form of Jewish mysticism, ecstatic Kabbalah, has its origin in the prophet Ezekiel, and it was further developed in the Middle Ages by the Merkava or throne mystics who attempted to have the same vision of God that the prophet Ezekiel had. These mystics cultivated a variety of techniques to achieve this goal, including fasting and chanting of various mantras. Some of the texts of these chants have been incorporated into the traditional liturgy for the high holidays, namely for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The mystics, however, recognized all too well that mystical experience could lead both to ecstasy as well as to catastrophe. In other words, that one could arrive at the destination, but they also recognized that the trip toward the destination could end with a devastating crash landing. Forms of ecstatic Kabbalah are found in the 16th century writings of Rabbi Moses Cordovero and in the late 18th and 19th century practices of East European Hasidism, especially in Romania and Hungary. But the central figure in ecstatic Kabbalah is the 13th century Spanish Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia. In his writings, and in the writings of his disciples, many still in manuscript, we find perhaps the most extensive descriptions of techniques for Kabbalistic meditations. Here we find the use of various forms of body postures, head movements, focus on mantras consisting of various combinations of the consonants of God's name, further combined with the vowels, focusing on various visual images consisting of the letters of God's name, focusing on various colors and color combinations, use of candles in meditation, mental contemplation of the letters of the divine name, and use of various mystical tunes, most of which we no longer know, to induce autosuggestive hypnotic trances. Now, the mastery of many of these techniques was reserved for the mystical elite, And in Hasidic circles, the custom was for these techniques to be handed down from the Hasidic master to his successor orally, never to be written down. And consequently, like so much else in Jewish life, knowledge of these techniques was a casualty of the Holocaust, where most of the Hasidic masters and their disciples were murdered. So today, many of these techniques remain unknown. Today, there are many individuals passing themselves off as Kabbalistic masters. One such person even sells anti-earthquake amulets in Los Angeles. But here again, there is a paradox. A true master will never admit that he or she is a true master, because it's somewhat like a humble person advertising their humility. The true masters are the hidden masters, who know that the inner core of Kabbalistic knowledge is not for the untutored masses, but rather for those who devote their lives to mastering what they know cannot be mastered, at least in our world, at least in our dimensions of time and space. The final paradox, therefore, is that the true master is one who believes he is not a true master. For as the Kabbalists teach, our world is the Alma de Pruda, the world of separation, the world of veils, where absolute truth always eludes us. The best we can do is to penetrate a little bit into the realm of truth. For the mystic, the apparent is not necessarily the real, and for some, simply knowing that and having the wisdom to perceive that is enough. The true mystical master is one who knows that all he or she has learned and experienced is but a prelude, is but a prolegomenon, a vestibule to the realm of the true and the spiritual. And though an accomplished adept, he or she knows that he or she is but a novice. For as the great Hasidic master Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev once said, why does each tractate of the Talmud begin not with page 1, but with page 2? The prosaic answer is because the title page is page 1. But his answer, which may be the true answer, is that no matter how much we experience, we haven't even yet gotten to page 1. But what we have done is to open the book. And this has been my task today, to open the book of Jewish mysticism for you. And I hope that now that the book has been opened, you will look inside to see what may be discovered there. But here too, there is a paradox. For as the great Kabbalist Rabbi Judilo of Prague put it, in searching for the destination, one discovers that the search itself is the destination. The road toward the destination is itself the destination. But the search begins by taking the very first step down the road. And I hope that you will all take that very first step, and I also hope that your very first step won't be your last step. Thank you.